Okay. All right. So we'll start with our prayer. And this week, it's the correct prayer. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all Holy Scripture to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you've given us in our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen.
Amen.
All right, so today we're going to talk about the flood, which is in the opening chapters of Genesis. It actually takes place in Genesis 6 through 8, and I'll give a little bit of background and then jump into the actual text a little bit. But so the first 11 chapters of Genesis kind of stand apart from everything else in the Bible. Genesis 1 and 2 are two different stories of creation. The first is the 7-day one. The second is the Adam and Eve Garden of Eden one. The Adam and Eve Garden of Eden story continues with Cain and Abel into chapter 3, and then continues with chapter 4 with a bunch of different people who kind of represent the beginnings of different types of civilization. And the music makers and artisans and technology and that kind of thing, any kind of early invention that you'd expect to have come over the first however many tens or more hundreds of, I don't know, in early humanity, farming, painting, whatever, happens in chapter 4. And among those things is also the first people begin to call on the name of the Lord. So religion is kind of lumped into that as well. In chapter 5, you get the first of what ends up being kind of a number of lists of descendants, and it's descendants of Adam that get you from Adam and kind of retrace our history, but also center us on one group of people, right? Chapter 4 was kind of all the descendants of Adam all over the place. Chapter 5 is kind of the specific line that gets you from Adam through Seth down to Noah. And there's a couple of fairly famous people that show up in that list. Methuselah is there. Methuselah is Noah's grandfather. Methuselah's great-grandfather is a guy named Enoch who walks with God. And God takes him. He's the first person sort of not to die in the Bible. And so it's Enoch and then Methuselah, who lives the longest ever. And then a guy named Lamech, who we don't learn much about. And then Noah is the next one. And so then the story of Noah and the flood takes place in chapters 6 through 8. And we're going to look at that today. Chapter 9 is a covenant with Noah, which is very important because it's the first covenant. Chapter 10 is another list of descendants, and it's Noah's descendants through his children, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And then chapter 11 is the last part of this sort of primordial history story before we get into people we really do recognize, and that's the Tower of Babel, is chapter 11, which, if you remember, is when humanity thought they were so great, tried to build this wonderful city in this giant tower that reaches to the heavens, and their language is confused, and they end up spreading across the whole earth. And sort of that's the beginning of not just language, but different peoples and people all over the place. Chapter 12 is the call of Abram, and that begins a whole different portion, which covers the rest of the book of Genesis, but also continues into Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the rest of the books of the Bible, because it goes from Abram to being Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and the stories around them, and then Jacob and his children and Joseph, and then Joseph gets us to Egypt, and then we end up with Moses and go from there. But those first 11 chapters are quite different from everything else that we encounter. They're stories that talk about things that basically, for lack of a better way of putting it, nobody would have been around to write about. So let's like throw that into some context. The obvious one is the creation. Nobody's around, and yet somebody's writing about creation. Nobody's around, and yet somebody's writing about the atom being made out of dust and the breath of God. And so these stories give us, they tend to have very large theological points and tend to draw on a number of kind of common elements that are certainly part of Judaism, but also tended to be in other cultures as well. Every religious culture has some creation narrative. A lot of religious cultures have some flood narrative. And the point here, you can get bogged down in whether it happened or not, and that's a different issue to a certain degree. A better question is why is this story being told the way it is being told to us? So I hope that makes a tiny bit of sense. Something that's worth getting into that's going to confuse you a little bit is some of the sources really do matter when you're talking about Genesis, which is really, really old, and stories that sometimes appear to have two or more versions of them, right? You think of the creation stories in Genesis. You've got chapter 1 and then chapter 2, and you can make them into one story, but it's pretty clear that humanity is created in chapter 1 on a certain day, and then we revisit the entire thing and have another version of the entire story in chapter 2. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but getting into that, what I want to ask is, if you read or not in advance, how many days was the flood? Anybody?
Okay, so I was a little confused because at some point it seemed like it was 150 days where it prevailed, and then it took another 150 days to recede, right? But then if you look at Noah's age, it seems like it took a year and some months, but their year was not our year. So I guess that accounts for it.
Okay,
So,
any that's good. Anybody else? How many
over
days?
a year. Oh, I say over a year, but then I cheated and I Googled it, so I won't say the answer.
That's fair. Okay. Anybody else? How many days do you remember it being?
Over 300.
Yeah.
That's what you remember it being? Sherry, you just said something, but you're muted.
Sorry.
Okay, I'm going to probably seem really ignorant. For some reason, I thought it was 40.
40, okay. So those are all correct, and we'll kind of understand why they're all correct. At the Easter Vigil, and I will share my screen very briefly in 2 seconds when I bring this up, but we read the flood, not every year, but we can read the flood every year at the Easter Vigil. And the story of the flood, which I will try to, well, I'll just have to tell you. It's when we read it at the Easter Vigil, it's Genesis chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, comma, verses 11 through 18, comma, chapter 8, verses 6 through 18, and then chapter 9, verses 8 through 13. So we're reading like 4 chunks of a 3-chapter narrative. And when we read it in those 4 chunks, we get a nice, concise, clear narrative that tells us that the flood lasted for 40 days. And so that's why we all remember it, because that's usually what we read, even if it's at the Easter Vigil or some other time, we tend to read this condensed version of it. How about the bird that Noah sends out at the end? Does anybody remember what the bird is?
Dove.
No.
It's a dove.
It's 2 birds.
It's 2 birds. Okay, so it's a dove or a
raven.
A raven. Okay. What about how many animals did Noah bring on board?
That was very confusing.
Correct.
Because it was 2 by 2, and then some with 7 or something like that, right?
Right.
The
okay.
clean ones versus everybody else.
But what does everybody
everything
remember?
else.
Everybody remembers what?
2.
2 by 2, right?
That's by 2.
Everybody remembers 2 by 2. So what we remember is the more simplified version of it. And the reason we remember that is for two reasons. When we go to now we go on Amazon, but when we go to the toy store, because our niece or nephew has been born and we're like, oh, I want to get a somewhat religious gift, I'll get a Noah's Ark. And you look and there's two, giraffes, and there's two, and the funny ones sometimes have two dinosaurs and that sort of thing. Or you go on to the Gary Larson webpage and he's got something about, unicorns sleeping in that day, and the two unicorns don't get on the ark, or something like that, right? But that's or we're reading the condensed version in church, and we're going to look at it in some depth today. But the background on this, and I'm happy to go into more deep background at the end of this, because I'm going to go a little fast through this. But the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and the history sections of the Old Testament, it's kind of clear, and let's just focus on Genesis, but it's kind of clear if you begin to study these things in depth that there are multiple sources that were compiled into Genesis. And that makes actually perfect sense. If you think about our gospel narratives, we have 4 gospels, and they kept them apart. It would not have been unrealistic to think that, well, maybe there's, maybe in certain cultures, and this has happened, those narratives get condensed into one thing and passed down like that. There's an Anglo-Saxon gospel combined version called the Heliond, which takes all 4 gospels and turns them into Anglo-Saxon. So Jesus is a chief, and all of his apostles are sub-chiefs, and it's a very bizarre read, but it puts it into their context and that sort of thing, but it combines all the gospels. And if you actually dig into the gospel narratives, you begin to see that it looks pretty much like Matthew and Luke had, if not Mark, an earlier version of Mark that they used as one of their sources when they're putting the gospels together. The same thing happens in Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. And in Genesis, you can most clearly see this in a couple of places. Creation is an obvious one. There are 2 pretty standalone stories of creation. The flood is a less obvious one. When you read the flood from start to finish, you can get confused, which is why we don't tend to read it that way. We read it in select chunks where you can get the narrative itself. When you read it from start to finish, and we'll see this again today, you begin to see, the more you read it, that it actually looks like there's 2 stories that have been merged together. One with 150 days, and the full timeline is a year, and another with 40 days. One with a dove that flies out, and clean and unclean animals, and another with a raven that flies out, and pairs of 2 animals. And when you begin to see them side by side, which we will do, it's crystal clear that they're standalone stories and that they were mixed together. And the question is why were they mixed together? We'll cover that. But they were mixed together in a way that, unless you're kind of looking for it, you won't see it immediately. You'll just think, gosh, the Bible repeats itself sometimes. And you'll think, was a year a different time back then, and that sort of thing? You'll begin to think that sort of stuff. Another story where you can see these doublets happen is often in Abraham's life. Something will happen twice. Like, he goes at one point, he has this strange adventure with his wife where he goes to Egypt and he pretends it's his sister, and he does the exact same thing somewhere else. And Isaac does the exact same thing years later, and you begin to wonder if it's multiple stories that they just didn't feel they could change or drop out, so they just kept them all. You see the same thing in the Joseph story where he goes down to Egypt. At one point, his brothers want to kill him, and one of them saves him. At another point, they want to send him into slavery, and one of them saves him. When he's in Egypt, a lot of things seem to happen twice. And if you're looking at it, you think, well, that's weird. On this time, he did this, and then the exact same thing happened, and it was slightly different. And you can read it as its own narrative, but you can also pretty easily separate it out and realize there's a couple of different sources. that seem to have gotten in here. For the record, you can do the same thing, as I said, with the gospel narratives. You can take Matthew and Mark, and you can begin to pull out the Mark sections if you want, and you can begin to take Luke and Mark and Matthew, and you can see that there's stuff that Luke and Matthew have in common that is not in Mark. And that, so you can kind of see this and begin to dig through it. The sources that generally are talked about in Genesis are they're lettered. And I don't know if anybody's ever encountered this. They're J, P, E, and D. And the reason they're lettered like that is J source is the one that likes to use Yahweh, and Yahweh in German starts with a J. All these are linked at some point to some sort of German thing. So the J source is the one that you'll see Yahweh a lot. And the J source is probably the oldest of the bunch. And the J source also tends to tell stories that don't really care that much about details, and numbers are biblically round, which numbers tend to, in the J source, numbers tend to be 40s or 80s, and that in, or 20s. And in Bible world, 20 is a reasonably long amount of time, but not that long. 40 is a really long amount of time. And 80 is like absurdly long. And J also tends to tell stories with a God that shows up and is much more anthropological and anthropomorphic, right? So J is the one where God is walking in the garden with Adam and Eve. J is the one in the flood story that literally closes the hatch on the ark. J is the one that shows up a lot in the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph stories, where Abraham is arguing with God and things like that. J is the one that gives us most of the Exodus narrative portions, right, with God and Pharaoh and Moses and the burning bush. J is the one that gives us a lot of the narrative portions in Numbers, which is God again talking to Moses. And so those are probably all the famous stories. P is the priestly source, and P is the one that deals with numbers and genealogies and things like that. So if you're ever thinking of things that have lots of detail in numbers, all those genealogies, that's all the priestly source. The first creation story that matches up with a religious 7-day week and the Sabbath, that's the priestly source. Anything that overtly matches up to religion tends to be the priestly source. Often when there is stuff about instructions about how to build this or that, whether it's the ark or the tabernacle or the temple, the priestly source is the one that's usually giving those instructions. The ones where God is distant and commanding things and very not anthropomorphic, not walking around on the ground, where God is in the heavens directing, things from afar, that's the priestly source as well, because God is all powerful in that sense. Then there's two other sources. There's an E source, which is the Hebrew word for God is Elohim, and there's a source that uses that all the time. And the reason you can discern an E source from the others is that E sometimes will have a second or third variant of some of these stories. And then there's a D source, which wrote Deuteronomy and seems to have redacted the entire first 4 books of the Bible and then some. So the D source is probably your later source and the one that compiles everything. Now, you can't prove any of this in terms of going back and finding these people, but if you begin to dig into the texts, it's more obvious than not. And you can't attach too much to it because we're thousands of years later. But what you can say with some certainty is that there were sources, and that shouldn't be unusual, right? And that somebody combined them and gave them to us. And that also should not come as any surprise. Like one of my Old Testament professors at one point said, and I've used this in a sermon and I'll get it at some point. He said, most of you come to seminary like you've got your precious faith, and it's like a crystal ball, right? You hold your crystal ball as your precious faith, and you've done everything you can throughout your entire life to shepherd it and take care of it, and you have the nicest crystal ball of anybody around, which is why you're in seminary, and you can take it out every now and then and really impress people at how beautiful and awe-inspiring your faith is. And he said, today I'm going to knock your crystal ball out of your hand and shatter it all over the ground, because your faith may be awe-inspiring, but it's totally fragile. And we're going to glue it together over the next year or two, and it'll be a basketball. And it won't be as pretty, and it won't be as awe-inspiring necessarily, but it'll be much more useful, and you can throw it around to people, and they can catch it and do what they want with it. And he said that in relation to these sources, because for a lot of people, this was like, wait a second, I thought the Bible fell out of the sky in Elizabethan English. And it's like, no. First of all, it was in Hebrew and Greek. And the more you learn about this, the more it's kind of like, okay, actually, this makes sense. It's in different languages. It took thousands of years. There's multiple books. Everybody's okay with that. But then you begin to think, well, how did we get a Genesis in the first place? Why was it compiled in this way? Why are there two creation stories? Why are some of these things duplicated? And you think, okay, so there were really important oral stories in the community that were passed down about how God interacted with our ancestors and why that mattered, and why it was that our stories, which may be similar to other stories, I mean, the Israelite stories may be similar to the Canaanite stories or the Phoenician stories or what have you, but why are our stories told in this way? Even if they're shared events like a flood, there's a flood narrative that happens, in multiple, Gilgamesh is one, multiple different cultures. So why is our story told in a specific way? Why does it include and always get to this person, Abraham, who had this covenant? And so the stories are told in a really specific way. And at some point you make the jump from oral tradition and oral storytelling to, okay, we've written them down, but now we've got two versions of it. How do we put them together? Or maybe we have an oral tradition that already combined these two versions. And that's why the flood story is so intertwined, because it was memorized with 40 days, 150 days. And if that seems really unrealistic, I took Greek for years and years and years and years and years. And if you know anything about Homer's Odyssey, it's enormous. And it was oral tradition for the first part. So is the Iliad. These books were memorized. They were stories that were memorized by these bards, and they trace it back to Homer, who was the first one who came up with it. And they are eventually, after hundreds of years, finally written down. And if you ever read the Odyssey, and the Odyssey probably dates from, 800 BC or something. Homer is supposed to be quite a bit earlier. But if you ever actually read the Odyssey, or next time you read the Odyssey, if you've read it before, there's stock phrases that come up all the time, like rosy-fingered dawn shows up all over the place. And there's all sorts of things and it's like, oh, why are we getting back to rosy-fingered dawn? Or why every time we have a dinner party, why does it have to repeat the exact same thing? And the second you realize it's because it's oral tradition, you begin to think, this is when the bard was remembering what came next and was using the stock line to sort of say, okay, rosy-fingered dawn came in and this and that. And which goddess is coming in now? Oh, right. And so Athena shows up after rosy-fingered dawn and does this. And it's not that different in the Bible in terms of its history. It almost certainly started as oral tradition and works its way eventually to written tradition. And you have things that are so cherished by the community because they speak so powerfully and so accurately to the relationship between this people and God, that when they write them down, they are not willing to throw out even things that are duplicates or even things that are slightly different. They keep them all. And in the New Testament, we have really crystal clear examples of that with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And you see, okay, we have 4 gospels. They basically tell the exact same story of Jesus, but a classic example is, when does Jesus flip over the tables in the temple? Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's in Jerusalem, right in the week before he's crucified. John, it's in Jerusalem 3 years earlier at the beginning of Jesus's ministry. Did he do it twice? Or did he do it once? Because each gospel only narrates it once. And if it was once, why is John at the beginning? And why is Matthew and Mark and Luke at the end? And is it because that's where they put it? Is it because and you don't know the answer. What you do know is he did it. It happened in Jerusalem, and it made people really unhappy. And John's reasoning for it is that Jesus kicks off his ministry with this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's like the straw that broke the camel's back at the end. And they use it for different purposes. But we get the same thing in Genesis with the flood narrative. Does that make sense? Somewhat. All right. So all of that, let's look at the flood. I'm going to share my screen and flood. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Is the whole thing visible, or is it, if not, you can drag your pictures of people up to the top, and that should be able to show you that. Does that work if you do that? So the flood narrative has pretty discernibly 2 sources. There's the P, which is the priestly source, and the J, which is the Yahweh source. And we'll read through each one separately, but I just want to give you a sense of how it's broken up. This is in order of chapter. So J kicks it off, and it tells the story of the Nephilim, and see the Lord, the Tetragrammaton, keeps showing up again and again and again. And then it changes gears, and the priestly source takes over. And you get into lots of details about the ark and how big it's going to be, and God kind of being the constructor, architect from on high, and a lot of the details that go into this. And then you go back to the other source in chapter 7, and you notice which name pops up again, right? That name didn't pop up in this zone, right? It was God, 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 right? And then you get to here, and we shift gears again, and we get the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. And then our detailed friend comes in to remind us that Noah was 600 years old. And then they go in, and then we switch back, and we get more details of animals and 7 days and this and that. And then we go back again, and we get 40 days, right?
Mhm.
And then we go back again to the priestly source, and we get some more details. Now, this is an interesting one. This does show up, and in this, I didn't do this, somebody else did this. In my recollection, most scholars will actually plunk this line to right here, so that it's actually, this is more of your anthropomorphic, and it's the name of the Lord. So this may be in the wrong place, but that is what it is. And you go back and forth, and you can see that as you go through it, here's your 150 days. That's in the priestly source. But it just continues back and forth each one. The raven is in the J source, and the other one, the dove, is actually in this one. And it just goes back and forth. And then at the end, in the J source, and this is the point, is all of this finishes and Noah builds an altar and worships. And you'd think that would be in the priestly source, but the priestly source probably is later and only adds religion to things when needed. And it looks like the J source, from the beginning, the purpose of this narrative was to tell the flood story in such a way that the animals were clean and unclean, and that when Noah gets out, he's able to sacrifice to the Lord from the clean and unclean animals, right? Like if you think about when we read our flood narrative each year, Noah comes out and he makes his sacrifice, and you're like, that's interesting. Which animals did he take? If he took 2 by 2, what did he sacrifice? And the answer is actually in the text is no, he took some clean ones and some unclean ones, and he sacrificed the clean ones of every clean animal and every clean bird to offer his sacrifices at the end. And so you just go back and forth through it. We'll read each one to get a sense of it, and assuming we have time. But it just keeps going back and forth. There's a covenant with God. This one, which is in the priestly source. There's another covenant in chapter 10 from the other source. So there's 2 covenants here, but it keeps going through. So what we'll do is, I think this might be interesting. We'll read the J source and get a narrative from that, if that works for everybody. And then we'll read the P source and get a narrative from that. So I think the easiest way to do this is to divide this up into these chunks. So Etta, can you unmute? And I'm going to go in this order so that we move Etta, Jim, Sherry, Barbara, Charlotte. Can we do that? So Etta, you're first. Read this section.
Okay. When men began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, and they took to wife such of them as they chose. Then Yahweh said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh, but his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards. When the Son of God came in to the daughters of men, they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old, the men of renown. Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. And Yahweh was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So Yahweh said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the ground, man and beast and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh.
So we'll dig a little deeper into this if we have time, but basically, and this Nephilim story is yet another kind of like strange things are going on. These are giants, men of renown, that kind of thing, that are half man, half God, half angel, something like that. But the point of this part that Etta just read is that things have become a mess. It starts with Adam and Eve. And remember, this is the same source from Adam and Eve. It starts with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and a failure there, and then a murder with Cain and Abel, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And by the time we get down to Noah, you have a situation where the heavens and the earth are both a mess and intermingled in some way that is not good. And the wickedness is so great that God basically decides to start again. All right, Jim, can you read this second section?
Right. Mm-hmm. Then Yahweh said to Noah, go into the ark, and you and all your household, for I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals. Take male and female and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean. The male is and his mate, and several pairs of birds of the air also, male and female, to keep their kind alive upon the face of all the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the earth, of the ground. And Noah did all that Yahweh had commanded him.
Great. Okay, so 2 things to note. One, this is 7 pairs of clean animals, a pair of animals that are not clean. Why? The answer is at the end. It's because the second Noah gets out, he sacrifices to Yahweh and builds an altar And what does he sacrifice with? Animals, right? So he uses the clean animals for that. And so he's got spares. What's missing? The ark is, there's no instructions about the ark, right? Like, it's built, it's done. So that's that. And so, all right, who's next? Sherry, can you read this part that I've highlighted?
And Noah and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood. And rain fell upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. The flood continued 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters. He blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the ground, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark.
Great. Okay, Barbara, can you read these two sections?
At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark, which he had made, and sent forth a raven, and it went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot, and she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put forth his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and lo, in her mouth a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him anymore. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when Yahweh smelled the pleasing odor, Yahweh said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease.
All right, Charlotte, can you finish this off? You're muted. You gotta unmute.
The sons of Noah who went forth from the ark were Shem, Ham, Jephthah. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled. Noah was the first tiller of the soil. He planted a vineyard, and he drank of the wine, and he became drunk, and lay uncovered in his tent. And Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father, and told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Jephthah took a garment, laid it upon both their shoulders, and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father's nakedness. When Noah awoke from his wine and knew that his youngest son had done to him, he said, and he knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, cursed be Canaan, a slave of slaves. Shall he be to his brothers? A slave of slaves shall he be to his brothers. He also said, blessed by Yahweh, my God, to Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. God enlarged Jephthah, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his slave.
Okay, this is an odd story, but it basically brings us full circle. So they've had the flood, and now things are beginning to settle back into almost exactly what they had been like before, right? So, right, so people start planting vineyards, and Noah gets drunk, and there's this strange scene, and we end up already with one brother making the slave of another. So it brings you back and basically it makes you wonder, well, what was the point? And the point was that humanity was a mess, still is a mess, but in this, the Savior and the divine agent is God and Yahweh, and if you worship God and Yahweh, you'll be able to get through hard times. That's sort of the point. There's a couple of things that are noticeable in this, is that Noah is more active than you might, than he will be in the next one. Noah is the one that releases the raven and the dove, so he takes sort of the initiative in when am I going to get out of the ark, and in the other version we'll see it's a little different. God basically says you can go now, and that kind of thing. So we're running a little late. If you have to drop off, I totally understand, but if you can stay on, we'll read the second one, which is a little longer, and we'll go in the same order. Etta, can you start and read this first portion?
Okay. These are the records of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its breadth, 50 cubits, its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and set the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, in which is the breath of life from under heaven. Everything that is on earth shall die, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you. And of every living thing of all flesh, you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kind, and of the animals according to their kinds, of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every sort shall come in to you to keep them alive, and they, oh gosh, I can't see it anymore now. Oh, thank you. Okay, come into you to keep them alive. Also, take with you every sort of food that is eaten and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him. Okay, Noah was 600 years old.
Keep going. When
the flood of the waters came upon the earth.
Okay, so a couple of things in here. This is the priestly source. It will strike you the second I say it. There's a lot of language that we just heard that is very reminiscent of the 7-day creation story in Genesis. God looked and saw that it was good. In this one, God looked and saw that it was corrupt, right? God looked and saw that the earth was corrupt. You see it again and again and again, right? Remember in the Genesis creation 7-day account, there's a lot of God created them, male and female, he created them. That shows up again and again. They shall be male and female. God creates what in the Genesis 7-day creation? Birds according to their kind, and animals according to their kind, and creeping things of the ground according to its kind. So a lot of the language is, we've already heard this. And if you were reading this right after the 7-day creation story, you'd be like, oh, okay, this is clearly the exact same author. And because it's a lot of the same phrases and a lot of the same words, and that will begin to show up again and again, including, if you remember from the old Bibles, things like the firmament above and the firmament below, and God separated the waters from the, in the different firmaments, that even shows up. Okay, Jim, you're up. Can you read these 2 things right here?
Right. Of clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds, and of everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded Noah. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month. On that, all the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. On the very same day, Noah and his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife and the three wives of his sons with them entered the ark. Every beast according to its kind, all the cattle according to their kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and every bird according to its kind, every bird of every sort. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And they that entered, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him, and Yahweh shut him in.
Okay, good. So a couple of things. Up above where Etta read it was instructions on how to build the ark. Our priestly source loves instructions on how to build things. And so we'll get a lot of that as you begin to read through the Bible, instructions on the tabernacle, instructions on the temple, that kind of thing. Our priestly source also really loves to link things to specific days in the calendar. And if you think about that for a reason, why might that be? Well, today is March 25th. It's the Feast of the Annunciation, right? And that's a Christian feast. But every year on March 25th, it's the Feast of the Annunciation. Well, why is it March 25th? Well, because it's 9 months before Christmas. Well, why is it December 25th? Well, that's a different story for a different day that gets into some of that background. But those calendar dates are something that has always been really important in religious history, and our priestly source, I don't know if there's a feast day now or if but there probably was at some point on the 17th day of the month, which was the second month. There probably was some holy day that they're referencing here, right? And there may still be, as far as I know. Going back to the creation account of 7 days in Genesis, remember where the waters were separated from above and the waters were separated from below? And if you've ever seen like a chart version of that, it's as if water was everywhere, and God says, I'm going to push the water down and I'm going to push the water up and create a dome above and a dome below. In this account of the flood, it breaks. The fountains of the great deep, water comes from below. There's no rain. There's nothing about rain here. The windows of the heavens are opened up. So like there's literally holes in the firmament above and holes in the firmament below, and the chaos that was eliminated in creation is let back in. So this is very much like a going backwards from the 7-day creation account. Okay. Who's next? You guys have moved around on my thing. I think Barbara is next. And it's these 2 paragraphs.
And the waters prevailed so mightily upon the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters prevailed above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep. And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, birds, cattle, beasts, all swarming creatures that swarm upon the earth, and every man, everything on the dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life, died. And the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry.
Great. Okay, a couple of things. The again, we get links back to creation. if you remember in the creation story, how does God create the where is it? God is the spirit, and a mighty wind or the spirit blows over the earth, right? So we're getting a new creation is what's going on here. And the difference in scale between the other version of the flood, the J version, 40 days, it rained a lot. This one, we've already got 150 days, and it started in the second month. Now we're up to the 10th month, okay? So, and it keeps going after that. It goes into the next year, right? And so the scale of this one is totally catastrophic, and it takes a year of or more. And this is literally like creation is coming to an end and being recreated. Whereas in the other one, it's a very, very giant natural catastrophe. This is the end of the world, right? And there is a difference. It's one is a catastrophe, and then this one is the end of the world and a completely new start. And again, we get these dates. So it's unclear to me, I didn't research them, but the odds are good that these dates on these particular things, there were, if there are not still, but there were religious festivals probably attached to these days that had to do with most likely things like a new harvest or something like that, right? Like it's all beginning again. We pray for, the beginning of things and that kind of thing. Charlotte, can you read from here, then God? And I think just do this portion and we'll go from there.
Then God said to Noah, "Go forth from the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring forth with you every living thing that is with you, of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may breed abundantly on the earth and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth." So Noah went forth, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him, and every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves upon the earth went forth by families out of the ark. Let me go on.
Yeah, you can keep going. Read the next paragraph.
And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and upon every bird of the air, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. For your lifeblood, I will surely require a reckoning. Of every beast I will require it, and of man. Of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image, and you, be fruitful and multiply. Bring forth abundantly on the earth and multiply in it.
Great. Okay, so a couple of things. One, again, you should be hearing a lot of Genesis 1 language. Be fruitful and multiply, be fruitful and multiply, be fruitful and multiply. Also, do you remember the business of God gives them all the beasts and the creeps and this and that, and the green plants? I mean, this is another exact same kind of language. What's really interesting here is it's very obvious from this account that it seems that the assumption was they were vegetarians up to this point, or at least they were not allowed to eat meat, and now they're given permission to eat meat. But because it's our priestly source, and if you remember some of your Jewish rules around food, right, which are not insignificant about what you're allowed to eat and what you're not allowed to eat and that sort of thing, this is our first priestly kind of rule around, well, what's okay to eat? And it gives you can eat everything, right? Except you got to kind of modify it a little bit. And we'll see as we move through the first few books of the Bible, this is the beginning of food restrictions around meat. And it comes more and more and more. But it's linked, and this is pretty important, and it also gets into a lot of the other stuff in the law. Food restrictions are one thing, but usually more important in terms of legal law side of things is how you treat others. And this is sort of the first version of this. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. This is an eye for an eye, right? Is right in here. And the reason is that for God made man in his own image. So you begin to get the jump into Leviticus and Exodus and things like that. Jim, can you read these, or Jim and Catherine? I don't know if you want to read too. Either one of you.
Okay. God said to Noah and to his sons with him, behold, I establish my covenant with you and descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and the beasts of the earth with you, as many as came out of the ark. I establish my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations. I set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be as a sign the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant, which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh, and the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will look upon it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant with which has established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth.
Finish it off. Yeah.
After the flood, Noah lived 350 years. All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died.
All right, great. So I'll show you my questions, and then I'm going to get out of this. How do I stop share? Okay, so I hope when you're hearing it, especially reading it like that, is it kind of obvious that there's two standalone narratives there? They mix together quite well. It's actually way less confusing if you separate them apart and try to read them like that. We don't do that because this is a scholarly reproduction of what these sources probably or may have looked like, but the canon that's passed down to us, and this is important, is the whole story is combined into one thing. And the reason for that is, or at least maybe, that both stories have a lot of important stuff in them, and rather than telling it twice, they were combined together into one story that gets all of the bits in there. And the details of 40 versus 150 at the end of the day are less important than the overall message that that God was involved in this, and that who these people were and that sort of thing. A couple of things. There's a terrible movie that I do not recommend, but on the off chance you end up going and searching for more things, I think it's called Noah or the Flood. It stars Russell Crowe and Anthony Hopkins. It's atrocious. There's rock monsters, which we didn't read about in this, that show up. Don't watch that movie. And some historicity that's, I think, is worth knowing. People forever have been trying to find the ark. There's a guy somewhere in the Midwest that has built, based on the priestly directions, has built an ark. That's always interesting. But as it says, Mount Ararat is where the ark ends up resting in the priestly narrative. People have tried to track down, could it have happened in some way, shape, or form? The short answer is, do you remember the tsunami from however many years ago, 2003? So the short answer is, yeah, we actually know something like this can happen. And that was just a standard tsunami. What is worth going on to is the History Channel from time to time, and you can probably look it up, has a story about mega tsunamis. And that's when a like basically the side of a volcano in the ocean falls off and turns into, and it doesn't happen very often. When it does happen, it's so catastrophic that it wipes everything out everywhere. And the island of Thera in Greece is, you can visit it today. It's a volcanic island that's a circle. It looks like a circle of islands. It was a volcano, and they think that when Thera erupted, there was a thriving city on Thera that vanished. And that city may be the basis for Atlantis and things like that. So can this kind of thing happen in the natural world? Absolutely. A tsunami or a mega tsunami could, and a mega tsunami can go all the way across the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean and wipe out stuff on the other side. So it's interesting to see how that links up in terms of historicity. Well, I would say that, and related to that, they do think that at some point the Black Sea may have been more of a valley, and that at some point there may have been a collapse over in the Bosporus and Dardanelles, and that it may have filled up rather quickly. That would also create a possibility of a flood narrative. So it's not unlikely that some sort of flood happened that was a total catastrophic natural disaster in that entire area that was remembered way, way longer. If we didn't have news sources, the tsunami from, 15 years ago would still be remembered in, as being this absolute catastrophe, right? Because it still is. But if that had happened to us, that would have been remembered for generation after generation after generation. So these things can happen and people try to track down when it could be. You can't do that. You'll never know if there was, one flood that everybody's talking about or that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, the theological purpose is what you want to try to dig into. There is this flood narrative, and we have, I think it's wonderful, we have two versions of how it's recounted, and each of those versions talks about how creation has gotten out of control and people are bad, and the everything gets destroyed, but humanity and all the creatures are saved by God. And what's the lesson in that is that God is the savior, is the judge, is the creator, and out of both of these things, religious ceremonies and customs begin to happen. So that's the flood. It went longer than I anticipated, but such is life sometimes. Any questions or comments or anything at all?
So I have a question about Noah, right? So the Bible version that I have, because I did do my homework, it says that he's an ordinary man, yet he lives this extraordinarily long time. And what is the story with the gods and the angels and the daughters and all of that?
Okay.
I just had never focused on that.
Those are both great questions. The Nephilim are the name of that group, and they show up in a couple of, at least one other place. I can't remember, it may be Numbers. They show up again. The name of them shows up, and that is, and the question is actually the same, or the answer is the same. Prior to Abram, everybody is living really, really, really crazy long lifespans. And I think that Noah's age is different in the two narratives, but it may not be. In one of them, maybe in one of them it said, I thought I heard this, that the normal lifespan for people at that time was 120 years, and Noah's living 950 years. 120 years is long, but at least it's more realistic, or in terms of what we have today. But those first 10 chapters give you kind of a pre-history of history. They're dealing with things that are so far out of memory that, people are living for hundreds and hundreds of years. One person is responsible for music. One person is responsible for all art. One person. And so a lot of things are getting attached to these ancestors that are lived forever and were walked with God and were responsible. One person is responsible for like all evil, right, and that kind of thing. And so they're stories that are fantastic, and mixed into that fantastic nature is another story that we don't read, that things were so different back then and so interesting that at one point there was a group of giant people that were intermarrying with the sons of God, and like, what in the world does that mean? And what it means is that, so this was when all of our legendary stuff happened. and all of our legendary stuff happened, and then the flood happened, and we move on from our legendary stuff, and we move into an era where we actually have narratives that sound much more like, I mean, there is some really interesting stuff that happens with Abram and that sort of thing, but the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses is when God interacts, you get but you don't have anything on the scale of what you have in those first 10 chapters in Genesis. And so that's, I think that kind of answers the question. An ordinary man at that point, Noah was one of what everybody else was. They were all living to these crazy ages. And that all gets wiped out. If you do the math on some of the ages of people, and I don't recall off the top of my head, but I think if you do the math, like Noah is still alive when Abraham is born. If you begin to actually, and that doesn't make any sense at all. And so that whole era is kind of a different, it's kind of a legendary era, right? And Ken and Susan talked about this at some point with, well, what is myth? And she said, we think of myth now as things that are fantasy and never happened. But in the Bible, a myth is more something that there's a deep truth in it, so it's always true. And the details of how it's told are what make it mythical, but the truth behind it and underneath it is always there. And that's a hard distinction to make, but it's not that dumb Noah movie that Russell Crowe is in. And I like Russell Crowe and Anthony Hopkins, but that movie takes it and turns it into like a Harry Potter fantasy or something, or a Lord of the Rings fantasy. It's like, we're not talking about fantasy, and dragons and magic and that. What we're talking about is deep truths about how people interact with God, told in sort of in the common language that all people would have had about events that took place before any of us were here, how music started, how art started. Remember that flood that our ancestors told us about? What did that mean? That kind of thing. And the lesson in the first chapters of Genesis is God is present in these things. And where God is not present, that speaks volumes. So I hope that kind of answers that.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Charlotte, you're muted.
Yeah, I just want you to please hold up that study Bible that you showed us before.
Oh, sure. This is the one I generally default to. It's a HarperCollins.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to necessarily buy this one, but the New Revised Standard Version is good with Apocrypha study Bible, and it ought to be about yay thick.
Yes.
The Oxford, like that. The Oxford one is fine. I have an Oxford one behind me, or maybe I have that at home. But yeah, they're just useful because you can look at the notes, and like you can look at the notes on the Nephilim in chapter 6, and get a little bit you'll get some detail, not much, but you'll get some detail there. So anything else?
No, thank you.
We lost our other couple of people because they had to go, but that's okay.
Yeah.
So sorry for going a little long, but the flood is interesting, right? Like it's kind of a deeper dive than, there's more Bibles. There's a lot more Bible study there than just kind of like, did it happen?
Yeah.
A better question is, could it happen? Of course it could have happened. Could it happen the exact way it's narrated? I don't know. Sure. Why not? But like, could a giant flood happen that wipes out everything? It has happened. So
Yeah.
it's actually happened in our lifetime. So, could it happen? Of course it could happen. How you tell that story is what matters. And the point of this is that they tell it so that God is involved. And of course, God has to, and people are like, God is so awful in this. God is bringing down wrath and judgment. But if you tell it in a way that God is not involved, you take away the all-powerful nature of God, right? So God is the judge. And that's, if you don't have that, then you end up with a system where something is so powerful that it wipes out the creation that God had, and God has to bring it out. It's like, well, the way this is told is God is so powerful. And I actually like the priestly version almost a little more, because it links up, and we never read those bits, because it links up with that first chapter of Genesis so well, where you get creation and the creeping things and the winged birds and the fish and the green things and that kind of thing. And God saw that it was all good. And then we get this other version, and God saw that it has all become corrupt. And God uses the exact same mechanism, where in the creation story, God separated the firmaments from above and below and moved the waters out. Now God just pulls the plug and lets everything come back in and wipes it out, and we get a new creation. So it's neat to read them like that.
Mm.
But all right, I've got to go. I've got,
Okay.
but it's great to see you all. Next week, it's Maundy Thursday next week, and we're going to look at the Holy Eucharist at 8 a.m. And two things. Today is the Annunciation. If anybody's around, we have a Eucharist at 5 in the garden. It'll be outside. And next week is Maundy Thursday, and the Maundy Thursday service will be at 7:30, but our Bible study will be at 8 a.m.
Okay.
Maundy Thursday will be at 7:30 p.m. Bible study at 8 a.m. All right.
Okay.
All right. Good to see you all.
All
Have
right.
a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Good day.